talking about the difference between apologizing and taking ownership. Now, Meg, I know that sometimes we might be in some sort of an argument and you look around and you think, what just happened? Where did this come from? And if you're not sure about what went wrong, how do you take ownership of that situation?
Yeah, it's a great question and goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning. It really requires us to have some humility to be able to pull the thread, to really look at that situation objectively and see what was my role? Again, what was my contribution? If I'm able to detach from that situation, we talk about detaching from emotions, not being emotionless, but we know our emotions, when we get caught up in those, they don't help us make good decisions. So if we can detach and really see objectively, okay, here's what happened. Here was my role in this situation. Now I can take ownership of that. And it doesn't mean that I have to own the whole thing, but I am absolutely going to take ownership of my role and what I did, what went wrong, or what mistake I made, what error, whatever the case may be. But our ability to do that really relies in our humility and really being able to, again, just take that step back for a moment to really assess the situation honestly and see where we went wrong.
So, Meg, what are some of the barriers to taking ownership?
There's so many. We could go on for days talking about this.
We don't have days, just as an FYI.
There are, unfortunately, there are a lot of barriers, and we've talked about a couple of them. You know, this fear of losing respect, fear of being the only one. Hey, if I'm the only one to take ownership in this situation, what does that mean? Right? But if we are the only one to take ownership, then that means we are the only one who can solve that problem. Not the only one who can solve that problem, but we can implement a solution to solve that problem. And oftentimes, you know, our goal with taking ownership is not with the expectation that someone else is going to do it. That's what happens, generally speaking, when we have good relationships, but that's not always the case. So that's a barrier: fear of being the only one, fear of losing respect. Probably the biggest barrier to us not taking ownership, it's our ego. It's ourselves. It's the lies that we tell ourselves, right? And the excuses that we make. And our ego is something that we're fighting all the time. Every one of us has one, and it is talking to us constantly. It's telling us things all the time about, Meg, you're right. It's not your fault. That's on somebody else. So we have to be able to recognize that ego when it's getting in the way, shut it down, subordinate that thing so that we can truly see what has happened, what's gone on in this situation, and take ownership where we need to take ownership. But those are just a couple of the barriers. As I said, Liz, we could go on for hours talking about the barriers, unfortunately, but the ego is probably the biggest one. It does get in our way a lot. It can be a really resourceful thing for us. It can also be a major hindrance for us being able to move forward, build good relationships, do a lot of the things that we want to do.
You know, ego is a deadly thing to have because a lot of people don't want to apologize because of an ego, and they don't want to take ownership because of an ego. But I think in order for you to take ownership, you have to become vulnerable. And I think as human beings, there are times that, you know, we should be vulnerable and take ownership of a lot of the stuff.
Absolutely. That vulnerability is a big piece of it, right? Because it is saying, it's not allowing our ego to get in the way. And it is being open and honest with someone about and admitting to a mistake. And sometimes those mistakes can be small, but sometimes those mistakes can be massive, big things. And we can't not take ownership of those things, but take ownership of the small things. So I think, to your point, that vulnerability is really critical, especially for us as women. Oftentimes we can share with one another, but sometimes when we're sharing with another colleague or a larger group, it can be difficult. But I think that does build that respect. It does build that trust when we show that vulnerability. It shows others that, hey, it's okay to mess up. It's okay to make a mistake. And now we can solve that problem. We can implement a solution for that thing to go away so that it doesn't happen again, or that we fix that error moving forward. So that's a really great point. I appreciate the additional context there and really thoughtfulness there.
Well, thank you. And you know what I love the fact is that you said, it's okay if you make a mistake, you fix it and you move on, because too many people out there are afraid of making a decision because they're afraid of making the wrong decision. So don't go away. We'll be right back with more with Meg.